So thank you all for coming. החלק הזה הולך להיות באנגלית, שני החלקים הנוספים שלנו הולכים להיות בעברית. My name is Hila Shamir. I'm a law professor here at Tel Aviv University. I'm also the principal investigator of TraffLab, an ERC-funded project. And I'll be chairing these first two parts of today's event. So as many of you know, on December 31st, 2018, the Israeli parliament passed the prohibition of consumption of prostitution law, או בעברית חוק איסור צריכת זנות, הוראת שעה ותיקון חקיקה. By doing so, Israel became the 10th country in the world to join the regulatory experiment of criminalizing the purchase of sexual services. The law follows what is known today as the Nordic model or the Swedish model, an approach that focuses on demand. It's called an end demand law, and focuses on the clients of sex workers, individuals who buy sexual services, under the assumption that prostitution itself or the prostitutes themselves are victims of the exchange, and therefore everyone around them should be criminalized by they themselves are the victims. In the event today, we will critically examine this law, particularly asking what will it mean for sex workers. The event is the result of a collaboration of TraffLab, my research project, and a new sex workers organization, Argaman, Scarlet, an organization of working women. And I would like to thank all the brave men and women of Argaman for collaborating on this, and the Safra Center for Ethics for sponsoring this event, and Debbie Seaton, who I think is not here, TraffLab's administrative director, for putting all this together. So the first part of the event will be in English, and we'll begin with our keynote speaker. So I'm really honored to have with us today Petra Ostergren. I'm probably not pronouncing your name. Petra is a Swedish anthropologist who has been researching Swedish sex work policy and discourse since the late 1990s. She's been an important voice in Sweden in critically examining the law. She was published and interviewed extensively about the law's origins and effects. Petra is based in Lund University, where she's writing her dissertation, The Swedish Sex Purchase Ban, Ethnography of the Law. It explores the functions of the sex purchase ban and links it to wider socio-political events and discourses. She's also been a part of a really interesting research project, an interdisciplinary EU research project called Demand Anti-Trafficking, where researchers examined approaches addressing and reducing the demand for trafficking in human beings through anti-trafficking efforts and policies. Today she'll be talking with us about the origins and outcomes of the Swedish ban against sex purchase. Now, we know that this is a controversial topic. It's at the heart of many of the people who are around these tables here. And I'm really grateful for all of you for coming. And what I want this event to be is respectful. I want us to be respectful for the people who are going to be talking here and respectful to each and every one of you. So I ask you to keep questions to the end. We will have a Q&A part in each one of the three parts of today's event. And Petra's talk will be followed by a Q&A as well. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you so much, Petra, for coming all the way. And I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Hila, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, TraffLab and the Sex Worker Organization for inviting me here. And it's a joy and pleasure to come here and see so many people, and I have no idea who you are, but I look forward to our exchange later on. What I will do today is to talk about how I understand the ban against sex purchase. And it is a ban that was introduced in Sweden 20 years ago, and that since have been implemented in 10 different countries, as Hila said, countries such as Norway, Northern Ireland, Canada, France, and Israel. These countries have one thing in common. Their prostitution policy is what I term a repressive kind. Ever since I began researching issues around commercial sex, there has been one thing that has puzzled and annoyed me. That the ways sex work is governed seems so complicated, so ambiguous, so paradoxical, and so is the way we speak about the different legal systems. For instance, there are bans against third-party activity, where it is, for instance, illegal to help sex workers advertise or is illegal to rent out working spaces or provide protection for sex workers, or is even illegal for sex workers to collaborate with each other. It can also be illegal to live off the earnings of sex workers. These laws are usually called pandering or procuring laws. There can also be bans against selling sex in certain areas of the city, so-called zoning laws. Or there can be bans against driving slowly in sex work districts, so-called curb crawling. There can be bans against asking to purchase sexual services, or it can be illegal to offer sex in a street setting. These are usually called soliciting laws. And of course, the act of selling sex can be illegal or legal only if you manage to get one of a very few limited number of prostitution licenses. Or it might be like in Greece, it's only legal to sell sex if you're unmarried. That goes for women though, not men, I think. And to even further add up to the confusion and the paradoxical situations, while third-party activity might be illegal, and it might be illegal to purchase sexual services, like everything around it is illegal, but sex workers might still have to pay taxes. Another thing that certainly does not make sense is why policymakers can claim that client criminalization in no way can harm sex workers, make their lives even more precarious. But think about it. When you implement a ban against sex purchase, how will the law enforcement find and fine the clients? They cannot possibly target all potential customers. They must monitor sex workers. That means that the police first must find and trace the people who sell sex in street settings or online. The police must then scout the streets where sex workers work. They must follow the cars where sex workers have entered. They must sit outside hotel rooms and listen with a stethoscope through doors and walls. They must peek into windows and apartments and homes. And once they know for sure that a sexual act is taking place, they must enter that car, burst into that hotel room or that home and arrest the often naked client and sex worker. And of course, this will impact the person selling sex. This is exactly how the ban is implemented in countries such as Sweden. And I'm not joking when I say that thing about the stethoscope. That is the device that doctors use to listen to a heart. That's actually what police do. They sit outside hotel rooms and listen to the sound of intercourse. And once they hear it, they will burst into the room. So where is the logic behind saying that client criminalization is introduced with the best interest of the sex worker in mind, or that it will not have any negative impact on sex workers? I think that the solution to this puzzle is to understand that the ban against sex purchase is one policy instrument in a repressive policy regime, and to understand that repressive regimes is a form of morality politics, where the best interest does not reside with the subject, the sex worker, but with protecting of the moral fabric in society. The main points I will cover today is that there are three general types of prostitution regimes: the repressive, the restrictive, and the integrative. I will also as I just said, talk about how client criminalization is one of many policy instruments in the repressive regime. I will argue that the repressive and restricted regimes are morality politics, and I will end with discussing the recommended policy approach as formulated by sex workers, human rights organizations, and scholars. But let's start with understanding the way sex work is governed. There are several ways to classify prostitution policies, and I don't know if any of you are researching prostitution policies. Please nod if you do. One, okay. But anyway, people talk about abolitionism, prohibitionism, criminalization, decriminalization, etc., etc. But there's a trouble with these categorizations. There is no consensus on what they mean and how they should be applied. And that's why we need, I think, a clearer typology. And if you want to know more details of how I developed this typology and all the things, there is, or will be,
over there.
Yes. There's a paper down there, but also I think we will have on the TraffLab website, there will be links to all this work. Yeah. Okay, so when we look at the policy and try to determine what kind it is, it's really important to not get caught up in all the laws, bylaws, and different regulations of the sex work sector, because they can be multiple and seem contradictory to each other. Neither should we pay too much attention to what policymakers claim what the aim is of a particular policy or measure, such as client criminalization. Instead, we should look at what the policy does, or as policy anthropologists phrase it, we must study through the system. More specifically, we need to figure out the sum of what the policy is trying to accomplish. This is what I call the 4 I's assessment protocol. We look at intentions, instruments, implementations, and impact. So what is the stated intention of the policy? Not the stated ideological intention, which often is to create a better world for women or something like that. No, the stated intention towards the prostitution or the sex work sector per se. Does the policy aim to totally eliminate, repress, get rid of the sector? Or does it try to restrict it? And next, which are the policy instruments? Is it criminal laws or labor laws? And are these laws at par with other laws that regulate other commercial transactions in the service sector? And how are these instruments implemented? Because there can be laws against, for instance, renting out apartments to sex workers, but the police might not enforce them. So it's not about law in book, but law in action. And fourth, what is the overall impact on the sector and the participants? Does sex workers have access to the welfare system? Can they seek protection from the police? Can they sue a customer if he doesn't pay or actually report him for rape? How does it work in practice? And depending on these questions, we end up with 3 policy types. Okay, so these are ideal types in the sense that they do exist in reality, but not in the purest sense, because with all policy, there's always contradictions and differences in regions and times. But in most cases, we can find a predominant policy approach. There's one thing I haven't mentioned, that in these 3 types, repressive, restrictive, and integrative, there are 2 fundamentally different understandings of what commercial sex is. Either that is an entirely negative social phenomenon, or that is a multifaceted social phenomenon containing negative elements. So depending on how you understand, how society understands, or how the lawmaker understand commercial sex, totally bad, and therefore it must be wiped out or restricted, or it has negative elements in it. From those two main understandings, we get these three different types. So the repressivist is a negative social phenomenon. It seeks to repress the sex work sector, mostly to protect society from harm from sex work, not sex workers from harm from others, right? And it does so with primarily aid of criminal law. And there are lots of countries that has a predominant repressive policy type. I mean, all the countries that introduced the sex purchase ban, Sweden, Norway, Canada, and France. And I think also when we spoke about it, you and I, Ila, is that we think that also Israel would be predominantly repressive. But there are many nations and states that would also have a repressive regime without having the ban against sex purchase. The restrictive policy approach, it also says it's a negative social phenomenon, but it has a more pragmatic approach and instead tries to limit or restrict it. So that's where you can find the zoning laws, the soliciting laws, the curb crawling laws, right? Or the licensing systems. So we try to say, okay, we don't really like this stuff in our society, but it can exist, but only not too close to churches or too close to schools, etc., etc. And here we find countries such as Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, some Australian states, and I think also partly Israel at times, yeah. Now, the integrative policy has an entirely different approach. It views commercial sex as a multifaceted social phenomenon, and it seeks to integrate the sex work sector into the social and legal structures of society in order to protect and empower sex workers. And it uses a totally different set of laws that I will return to. And there's not many actual examples in the world. New South Wales in Australia has that approach, and New Zealand. And I will give examples from the New Zealand law later on. What's important to know that in both the repressive and restrictive regime, you will have limited movement of both the sector and sex workers. In the repressive regime, the sector is always illegal. Sex workers have no access to labor rights, and it's very difficult or not possible to seek access to social security system, social and medical assistance on their own terms, to self-organize, collaborate with each other and others, and to self-regulate the industry. In the restrictive regime, such in Holland and Germany, the sector can operate legally, but only under conditions which are more restrictive than those of other service sectors. Sex workers might have partial access to labor rights, and they also might have difficulty accessing social security systems, etc. But what's important to note in both these types, and whatever combinations of laws these policies have, they impact sex workers negatively in several ways. And this is what research shows, empirical research from all over the world. We have had a lot of research in general, but now also the countries that have implemented a ban against sex purchase has come up with some really good stuff from Canada and France particularly. So I recommend, if you want to get into the more details, look at that. But they all point to the same combination, the same results. The combination of, for instance, third-party criminalization and client criminalization has a detrimental impact on sex workers. First, it leads to a hampering, a limitation of sex workers' health and safety measures. Because when third-party activity is illegal, sex workers cannot collaborate with each other. You cannot set up a working space together because it might be illegal to promote others' sex work or live off others' sex work earnings. That means I cannot hire a place together with another sex worker because then one of us or both of us will be regarded as procurer or pimps. So it's not possible to collaborate. You cannot hire security staff, private transportation, or rent work premises, right? Because it's illegal to rent out places to sex workers. That means that you're forced to work to use insecure workspaces, such as the client's car, or make out calls. Like you might not want to have this, bring the client to your home, so you go to the client's home instead, which might have negative implications because you don't know where you're going and what you'll find there and how to get out of there if you need to. They also might have to rely on criminal actors in order to get these premises and protection. So it's a whole range of negative consequences to access safety. And I think we have the expertise in here in the auditorium, so we can hear more about that later from sex workers themselves. But also, when the clients are criminalized, sex workers will have a shorter time to assess a potential client, right? Because there's always a negotiation. A sex worker will always check, can I trust this person? Can we make an agreement? If the client's behavior is illegal, he will be nervous, he will be stressed, there will not be as much time to negotiate and for the sex worker to assess the person. It might also be difficult to read the client, to know if the behavior has to do with him being not trustworthy or just stressed. The sex worker might have less negotiating power when the client is the one that takes the risk, right? And that, or if there are less clients in street settings. So this is what sex workers report, but there are also sex workers in Sweden that says, I think the law is good because that means I can charge more. Okay, that would not be people who mostly would sell sex on the streets, but maybe indoors in so-called the escort sort of segment. But it's different, right? All of this leads to, and this is what all the research shows, it leads to sex workers being more exposed to violence and exploitation. Plus, remember what I said in the beginning. Who will police survey? They cannot follow all the clients. They don't know who they are. They must monitor the sex workers. Sex workers do not want the police to find out where they live, right? So that means the sex workers become more hesitant to either call and ask police for help in case of a negative situation or bad situation, or to report a crime. Also, as a general outcome from the repressive and restrictive policy is that STI prevention might be complicated or stop. We know in Sweden, not because of the laws, but distribution of condoms to clients or sex workers has been seen as encouraging sex work and therefore stopped. Also, what we can see from the research is that sex workers have low trust in authorities and government agencies. They fear being under police surveillance, but also to be discriminated against. So they will not seek help or report crime, seek social and medical assistance, and many fear losing custody of their children. Also, the ban against sex purchase does not create stigma against sex workers. It's there already. But what sex workers say is it adds to an already strong sense of stigma and increased prejudice. So, coming from a human rights perspective, there's a really puzzling component here. Because when these negative consequences are brought to the attention of policymakers and advocates for the client criminalization, be it feminist or not, it's not met with an uproar. On the contrary, it's met with applause. In 2010, we had the first evaluation of the Swedish ban. And it was a state evaluation, a state inquiry. They did not interview many sex workers, only a few email, online questions. But those few, some of the sex workers that were organized in one of the organizations that support, there's one organization that support the repressive regime and one that's critical of it. The one in favor of repressive policy said that they liked the sex purchase ban. The other one, Rose Alliance, the members there, said that they were critical of the ban. So this is what the evaluation reports, that several sex workers that were interviewed online claim that criminalization has strengthened the social stigma associated with selling sex. And then the inquiry reads, even if it's not forbidden to sell sex, they, i.e. the sex workers, say that they feel hunted by the police. They feel as if they have been declared incapable of managing their own affairs, in that their actions are tolerated, but their will and choices are not respected. However, this did not alarm the inquirer. Instead, the comment was this: these negative effects of the ban can almost be regarded as positive when viewed from the perspective that the aim of the law is to combat prostitution. Okay. We find a similar sentiment from the interviews that Amnesty International made with high-ranking policymakers in Norway. Their official evaluation had found that client criminalization had led to reduced negotiating powers and an increase of abusive buyers. A senior expert at the Ministry of Justice commented these findings in the following way: it all comes back to the question of, is it a problem that people in prostitution are in trouble? He asked, or she asked, and continued. No one has said at the political level that we want prostitutes to have a good time while we also try to stamp out prostitution. But perhaps the most telling comment was made by a public intellectual in Sweden when she was discussing the pros and cons with the ban against sex purchase. She noted that sex workers, because of the ban, was worse off. But in the larger scheme of things, it didn't matter, she wrote. Perhaps there are a few thousand prostitutes that will be sacrificed on the altar of gender equality. It's not a dramatic stance, and it does not have to mean stigmatization. Well, actually, it is a dramatic stance, and it does mean stigmatization. So, how can we understand this blatant lack of care and ethics? How can we understand that policymakers accept that marginalized people are sacrificed in order to meet a higher purpose? We can understand it from the view of the whore stigma, loose women, women who are not married, women who are too much sex or sex in the wrong ways, have historically been treated as second-class citizens. And one of the problems is that the whore stigma is contagious, which Gail Peterson, the sociologist, noted a long time ago. So instead of standing in solidarity with sex workers, even feminists shy away from defending them. Respectable feminists do not wish to be taunted with the whore stigma either. The social costs are too high. And I think all of us who do research or are allies with sex workers' rights can recognize the stigma that comes with being in this field. But I also think the explanation is that we're not dealing with ordinary policy, but with morality politics. Okay, again, there's no consensus on exactly what morality politics is, other than that there are a class of political issues that concerns life and death, sex, drugs, and unproductive pleasures, such as prostitution, pornography, homosexuality, abortion, assisted suicide, alcohol, narcotics, gambling, etc. Some even call this a politics of sin or crimes without victims. There's a Dutch researcher, Henk Wagenaar. He and his colleagues have tried to sort of summarize what morality policy is in the following way: that they are political issues that are proxy for larger causes. They are discussed in an emotionally charged language. And I think it was really interesting, Hila, that you began this lecture or this seminar by saying, "Can we please keep like a civilized tone to each other?" Because we know that these issues, morality issues, will entice emotions. That's a part of its nature. It has not something to do with us as people or Tel Aviv right here, right now, or the ban. It is because it is an issue that concerns first value morality principles. Also, the solutions are explicitly ideological rather than pragmatic. The focus is on symbolism of large measures rather than detailed implementation. So when the ban against sex purchase was implemented in Sweden, the police got, something like €1 million, and that was that. They had to figure out how to monitor, how to implement the ban themselves. The symbolism of the law was more important than the detail. What's also curious with these issues is that are like owned by the general public. Anyone can be an expert on these issues. It doesn't matter that we have researched for 20 years or that you've been selling sex for whatever, 20 years and know a lot of stuff. When you meet someone who has never read a book, never read an article about sex work, never consulted research, never done it themselves, they can still be an expert. I feel that this is right. Would you say that about public transportation issues or other non-morality politics issues? So this also makes it really difficult to discuss these matters because facts are not important. These issues are immune to facts. Also, Wagenaar and his colleagues say morality politics are prone to sudden policy reversals. I'm not so sure. When I was thinking, I think that we see it more like slowly. Like I think that if we have a repressive policy when it comes to maybe cannabis or prostitution, it doesn't shift very quickly. Like it can be charged, but it's slow changes. Anyway, this, says the policy researchers, leads to a situation where effective, and these are the policy researchers that just happened to stumble into prostitution. They did all sorts of other policy issues, and they regretted their move later on because it was so infectious to be in these debates, they thought. Anyway, these Dutch researchers. They say that this leads to a situation where effective collective problem solving is subordinated and traded for symbolic positions instead. And I would like to add, there is no concern for the negative impact the policy has on targeted groups. like if it's those who sell sex or those who use drugs. Okay, so what is the alternative? What is an efficient, fact-based solution to the problems that sex workers face? What is what we would call ordinary policy instead of morality politics? Well, it is what I mentioned before, the integrative policy approach. Usually this is referred to as decriminalization. I think the term decriminalization is difficult because that is a legal act. You remove laws from the book. But what does, what is there instead? All sectors are regulated, also the sex work sector. So what we find in the integrative policy is that the sector can operate legally under conditions similar to other service sectors. They have access to, sex workers have access to labor rights. They can seek social and medical assistance on their own terms, organize, collaborate with each other, and self-regulate. That is, develop codes of conduct and ethical standards like all sectors does. Now, in New Zealand, they passed the Prostitution Reform Act in 2003, and it made it the first country in the world to have passed a policy that regards sex work as service work and that treats sex workers like any other occupational group. And I'll just talk briefly about that. It was initiated by the National Sex Workers Organization, New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, and also inspired by the New South Wales state in Australia. And it was also developed together with state authorities. This was not something that state authorities did by themselves, but together they developed this policy. So the explicit aim of the act, and it's a long act. It's not just one or two sentences, like goes on forever. It was to protect the sex workers from exploitation and promote their welfare, occupational health and safety, as well as to promote public health. So it wasn't only about the sex workers, but also public health in general. The stated overarching ideological goal was to safeguard the human rights of sex workers. So all laws that had been previously made acts such as selling sex, operating sex work premises, advertising, and living off the earnings of sex workers were repealed. Instead, an extensive set of regulation was enacted. Some of these regulations correspond to those of other sectors, service sectors, such as operators' certificates and health and safety requirements. But other regulations were specific to this particular sector, such as restrictions on advertisement, and also the Act restates the right of sex workers to withdraw consent at any stage of the transaction. So even if the two parties have agreed on what is going to happen, the sex worker can at any point withdraw consent without giving a reason. If the client or a brothel owner would push the sex worker to continue performing sexual acts, it is considered rape. Okay? So there is also special rights for sex workers here. And also, those sex workers who no longer wish to do sex work can still be entitled to receive benefits, social benefits or unemployment benefits without any quarantine period. Usually, when you start working, or if you just say, I want to quit, I'm not coming here tomorrow, I had it. I can't go and collect unemployment benefits the next day. I have to wait for 1 month, 3 months. That doesn't apply for sex work. You can go from one day to the next, from earning your living out of sex work to benefits. Apart from this, there are public campaigns to combat stigmatization, violence, and exploitation, and the policy is implemented and followed up on national and local levels. And the impact has been also closely monitored by academic research, and it shows that while the sector itself has not increased, no more people are selling sex, or no more, the sector is not any larger, but the sex workers report increased levels of safety, health, and trust in authorities. It's not a perfect system. They still have little glitches in the system that doesn't work. Sex work is still stigmatized. Sex workers, especially on the street, are still get abused by clients. But it's easier for sex workers and police and social services to collaborate. There's easier to make like apps, like safety apps. So you can register the number. If you get into a car, you register the number. You make sure that you get back. There's like a whole lot of different safety measures that can be done, and is done. Right, so to end, we always want recommendations, right, at the end. I would say then, first and foremost, when developing sex work policy, it's important to employ what is called a form of collaborative governance. And those of you who study policy development, you know about this term. That is, public agencies must reach out and they must reach out and engage with stakeholders, that is sex workers, in formulating and implementing the policy. It's also a collective decision-making process that is formal, consensus-oriented, and deliberative. It relies on all stakeholders to having sufficient capacity, organization, status, and resources to participate in the process. It's really hard, like in Sweden, to ask sex workers to come to the table and negotiate, because they will have to use their own resources to get there. They don't have an NGO that has millions of euros to fund their work. So that is not an equal standing between sex workers and other NGOs and state agencies. So this is the reason. So the recommendation, and of course an evidence-based policy, which is then the integrative policy, the decriminalization policy. And this is not something that I made up. This is what hundreds of sex worker organizations all over the world recommend. It is what the WHO recommends, the World Health Organization, the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, International Labour Organization, UNAIDS, even ILGA, the International Gay and Lesbian Association, came on board just, I think, last year. So it's no debating, if you look at the data and if you look at human rights organization, what should be done. Now, if this is about morality politics, long-standing historic repressive policies, it's not that easy to shift, right? So what can we do instead? I think there's lots of things we can do, still do, measures that can be taken to prevent violence and exploitation against sex workers in the existing policies. And I will not go into the details, but what we must do is apply context-sensitive measures. And that is something I developed together with this EU group, research group, Demand AT, when we looked at demand-side measures aiming to prevent trafficking. So we have copies. You can just grab one of those and look at it. But it's about ensuring the process of community empowerment, work to reduce stigma, reduce worker vulnerability, and ensure that sex workers can access health and safety services that are non-conditional and non-discriminatory. But I think what's most important, if we want to start like talking about what is the next step, what can we do, we must call things by the real name. The kind of policy that regulates prostitution in Sweden is not a unique Swedish model. It's not a Nordic model. It's not a feminist solution. It's a repressive policy model. And client criminalization is a repressive policy instrument. The last decade, policymakers have increasingly focused on targeting the demand side of sex work and trafficking in human beings. So also here in Israel with the end demand law. But let us be careful with this concept as well. One of the researchers in the Demand AT project pointed to the importance of limiting the meaning of the concept of demand to its core economic meaning. That is, the willingness and ability to buy a good or service. Consequently, phrases such as demand for trafficking in human beings does not make sense. It's not a goods or service. Therefore, it should be avoided. They also made it clear that when it comes to the sex work sector, sex workers have demands too. They demand the ability to be able to rent work premises, advertising spaces, security systems, administrative help, and health services. Or as sex workers put it themselves, they demand their human rights. Thank you. So the question is, not only with sex work, but other areas such as explosives or drugs, if a country does not want it, what would be the policy measures to get rid of this thing, right? Well, I don't think the criminologist has an answer to that. I don't think the policy scholars have an answer to that. What they do know is that criminal law does not really change people's behavior. There's other mechanisms, and there's a whole flora of research around nudging and stuff like that. But I'm really not well versed in those things, I think. And also, it is about, as we talked about before, if we want to repress something in the nation, how do we go about that? And we know it's really hard. So I do not have an answer.
I also want to respond quickly and just say that the idea that we want to ban an activity requires some justification in relation to why we want to ban it. And so we want to ban explosives because they cause harm. The question is, do we want to ban, let's say in the relation to anti-trafficking generally, do we want to ban domestic work? There's a lot of trafficking in domestic work. No, we usually don't want to ban it, want to prohibit trafficking, right? So the same goes, I think, I think the logic should be similar in relation to sex work. We want to ban harmful behaviors. For that, we need to make sure that we know what is harmful in this industry. And even in explosives, there's a realization that it's not going to disappear, right? That we want to do harm reduction. So that's a whole different question. So that would be my answer.
So you're asking how can the integrative model be applicable on really marginalized groups of people, really in any society, not only like in developing countries, right? Well, I think also New Zealand do have a large populations of marginalized people, and they work a lot with outreach to them. And what they say is that it's easier if it's not illegal to sell or purchase sex, to access people who are in need of help. So that's what they say. And also I think the UNAIDS report and the WH report and all Amnesty reports, they all talk about why it's easier to not use criminal law if you want to help people who are in different ways forced to sell sex to survive. That will not, it will just push them out even more in the margins. So it's not, yeah. I think that's general take. But can I just say that with the question before about what do we do to repress it if we don't use criminal law? What can we do? What I think as an anthropologist is interesting to ask, like, what is it in a society that wants to repress it or integrate it? And I'm a bit influenced here by like almost Freud. Right? So if we think about the nation as a body, why do we want to repress these things? That if it's homosexuality or like we want to ban it, or do we want, or prostitution, or it's not like, oh good, let's forbid it, make it illegal. Or can we say, yeah, it might not be always good, but let's integrate it instead. So, and that's what I'm looking at in my thesis also about with Sweden and New Zealand. What is it about these countries that say that New Zealand say, well, no, it's not that good to purchase sex, but let's integrate it. And Sweden goes, no, we don't want to have it here, we have to ban it, and you guys have to ban it too. So what is it like on the psychic sort of national level that makes us want to? I don't have the answer yet, but by the fall I will know. You can come to this station. Yeah. Well, it is institutionalized.
It is.
Yeah, I mean it's in the book. I mean it's legal, it's regulated, it's implemented. It's legal to sell sex.
But then the next level is that the country, the state is a pimp. That's what
The country's a pimp. Yeah, well, any nation that requires sex workers to pay taxes are pimp. Sweden is a pimp too. If you don't pay your taxes as a sex worker, the fiscal company will come after you. Like that's how it is. So yes, in that way, it's a pimp. You live out of the earnings of a sex worker. Mm. And then, again, we have this thing with the emotionally charged language. If we use the word pimp, you go, oh. But instead, yeah, well, okay. You take money, that's what you do. That's right. So what is the class aspect on the client criminalization? I'm just repeating your question so everyone can hear. So does it both for the workers and the clients, can you see a pattern here? Who is being targeted by the police? For sure, in the early days, the police would mostly survey or monitor street sex workers, and the clients will go to them because that was the easiest. But as time went on, they got more funding and can now have more resources to go online. So, of course, they don't trace all the the clients online because they can't find them. So what they do is that they look for the sex workers, and they will make calls to them and pretend to be a client, so they learn where she works or he works from, and then they would target that hotel room or that apartment. So today there's another stratification on what clients are being fined. Before it was more working class, and now it's more middle class. Also I read about 7-8 years ago interviews with men who were arrested for or suspected for purchasing sex. So even the attempt to purchase sex is criminal. So there has been cases where a man has had money in his pocket to his way to a sex worker. He didn't purchase sex, but he was intending to do it. He got caught and fined for it. So even thinking about it is illegal, right? But what has happened is, and what these people said in these interviews was, this man, they said, well, I was caught by the police, and they told me if I admit to having purchased sex, I can just get fined and I can pay the fees and it's over and done with. If I deny it, it will go to court, and then it will become public. So the man said, so I admitted even if I hadn't intended to buy sex, or now I regret it because I could have gone to court and just said no. So I think you might have there, like some men will know they can just deny it, that they try to purchase sex, because it's really hard to prove. And of course, men who are more well off can just go to Amsterdam or New Zealand, where it's legal. So yes, there is a difference.
Can you say a few words about the relationship between the anti-prostitution laws and anti-immigration laws, and also sentiments?
It's a really good point here, the relationship between anti-immigration laws and anti-prostitution laws. Because I don't know how your immigration laws, what they look like exactly here, but in Sweden it's illegal to... you have a law, okay, not so good, okay. But anyway, it's illegal to enter the country and to live off immoral work. I can't remember the exact word in English right now, but so that means you can't have immoral immoral income, and sex work is considered immoral. So that means if you travel in order to sell sex in Sweden, you will be stopped at the border if they suspect you will sell sex, or you will be deported. And we just had last week a big report in the newspapers about how how the custom police target women who are so-called trafficked or immigrating, and just the only law they use is the immigration law, and they don't even, if they suspect she's being trafficked, they don't even contact the anti-trafficking unit. They just deport her right away. So actually, that made people upset in Sweden, so that's interesting. So yes, the police will use anti-immigration laws to target sex workers. They would also have special courses or seminars for people in the service industry, like hotels, taxis, and taxi drivers. What signs to look for if they suspect is a sex worker? Does she come alone? Does she have a lot of makeup on? Does she have a lot of men coming to a hotel room? And if they suspect that she's a sex worker, if like the reception desk at the hotel suspects she's a sex worker, they give her a room near the reception desk so they can monitor her, and they call the police if they think she might be a sex worker, and they will, yeah. And also, I think in New Zealand, one of the little caveats they had in their law was that anyone except those, like students in New Zealand can work with anything when they come to New Zealand, but not in the sex industry. So they will have like this with immigration it gets a bit wobbly. Yeah, not done.
So we're going to take two final questions. So,
thank you very much. I'm curious to know whether this ban is enforced with the same vigor against homosexual or trans sex workers.
Right. So are clients who purchase sex from men or transgender people as much observed and monitored? Answer is no. We have had, I think, out of the thousands of men that's been fined for purchasing sex, I think maybe one or two are men who bought sex from men. So that is a really important observation, that they would target men who purchase sex from women primarily, sometimes transgender sex workers, but very rarely men from men.
Let me try and see if I understand you. So you're saying really it's the repressive and the integrative want the same thing, in a sense? Is that what you're saying?
I didn't think about that.
Oh,
No, I think, okay, let me try.
Okay.
I think what you're saying is that the underlying cause of selling sex or purchasing sex is in the childhood trauma. Is that what you're saying?
We know it.
We don't know.
Oh, here we go. Okay, exactly.
Not all.
No.
But we know that many cases.
No, we don't know that many men. We know that it's a very it's an argument that is being very used very frequently, but we don't know statistically that this thing.
I'm not talking about statistically.
Okay.
Even one, just one.
Yeah, but you also have lawyers that are.
Okay, I will let you work this out, but let me say a few things. One, we, again, remember what I said about morality politics. Anyone can be an expert here, and facts are not that important. So, but what's problematic with the sex work industry is really hard to research because it's a precarious group, and they don't want, many doesn't want to talk to researchers or police or, you know. So you will not really know what the childhood is for those who purchase sex or sell sex, if it's really that different from those who don't. We don't know that. And also there's a trouble with the causality in that. Does it make us want to? But let's say it is. Let's say it is a trauma. Yeah? In what way does criminal law help that trauma? Oh, no.
I'm talking about debate about the two moralities that we can discuss each other. And
Yeah.
discuss Freud. Let's try to combine
Yeah.
because the truth is inside the truth that we want to have. We want to even know it better.
Yeah.
No one of us really know.
Okay, I think that's too advanced for me. But maybe we should have this discussion in Hebrew, you and I, later. That'll be interesting. But I think it's time for someone else to talk now, and I found this really interesting. Thank you so much.
So